As the three men made their way to work that morning, nothing could have prepared them for the sights they were about to behold. A young teenager, lying in the middle of the road, crying out for help, with her body severely brutalized. Her injuries were so extreme that she could not bear to be touched. At the time, nobody knew who she was, what had happened to her, or how she ended up in the middle of the road with such severe injuries, but it was obvious that she must have gone through a horrendous ordeal. The young lady would later be identified, and before slipping into coma, she would narrate an ordeal so horrendous that it was tagged the most sadistic case in UK history. This is the story of Suzanne Jane Capper. Suzanne Jane Capper was born on September 1st, 1976 in Greater Manchester, England. She was described by her mother as a well-mannered girl and very forgiving. Before she was born, her biological father walked out on the family, and her mother went on to remarry a man named John Capper. Susan would take on her stepfather's name and go on to have two siblings, a sister named Michelle and a brother named John. In 1990, when Susan was only 14 years old, her mother and her stepfather got a divorce. This brought about an unstable home life for Susan. Her mother, Elizabeth Dunbar, walked out on her daughters without looking back, and Susan was forced to shuffle between staying with her stepfather John, friends and family, and whoever was willing to take her in, sometimes even local authorities. This instability affected Susan's mental health, and she couldn't perform well at school. She began skipping classes, and her teachers later described her attendance in the final 2 years of her schooling as erratic. However, despite all the bad things that was happening to her, Susan remained a gentle, high-spirited, and well-mannered girl. She would go out of her own way to help other people, but unfortunately nobody ever returned the favor, and some took advantage of it. At age 10, Suzanne began babysitting for a 26-year-old woman by name Jean Powell. Suzanne came to know Jean through a chance encounter with a boy same age as her by name Clifford Pook. He was sitting on his own by the side of a road one day, upset because he was having problems with his girlfriend, when Suzanne went over to see if he was okay. Clifford was Jean's younger brother, and he would ultimately go on to torture Suzanne. Jean, at 26, already had 3 children, who Suzanne babysat for free. Suzanne would often miss school because she was forced to work as a cleaner by Jean, who would then collect all the money she made. At first, Suzanne and Jean Powell's relationship seemed perfect in her eyes. She adored Jean with every fiber of her being and spent more time with her and her kids before completely moving in. She thought she had finally found one thing she had been looking for all her life: love and family, but unfortunately she couldn't be more wrong. Soon after Suzanne moved in with Jean, a 24-year-old drug addict by name Bernadette McNeely, a friend of Jean's, would move in with Jean. Like Jean, Bernadette also had 3 children. With Suzanne, Jean, Bernadette, and the 6 children all living in Jean's home, the small house became cramped and filthy. Jean and Bernadette were also dealing on drugs and stolen car parts, and this led to a number of questionable people visiting the house, which included Glenn Powell, Jean's 29-year-old ex-husband who had a criminal history. Despite being separated, he and Jean still sometimes got intimate. Bernadette's 16-year-old boyfriend, Anthony Dodson, who was also having sex with Jean. Jeffrey Lay, a 27-year-old drug addict with a criminal record, who was also having sex with Jean. And Clifford Pook, Jean's 17-year-old brother. As the relationships in the house began to get closer, they began to take advantage of Suzanne. At only 16, Suzanne was still naive and impressionable. Coupled with her good nature and desire to belong, she became an easy target, and the others soon began bullying her and beating her up. A month before Susan's death, Susan showed up at her mother's house, badly beaten and with a black eye. She begged her mother to stay for the night, but according to some reports, her mother had Leslie turned her away because she said her new boyfriend wouldn't like Susan being around, while other reports claim that her mom had said she needed a few weeks to get her room ready. With nowhere else to go, Suzanne returned back to Jean's house. When she returned, things only got worse. Seeing that she had no one to turn to, the group took the abuse to the extreme. They purposely accused her of things that she didn't do and punished her for it. In December 1992, the whole group was infected with pubic lice. And instead of taking the blame, since they were going back and forth with each other, they blamed it on Suzanne and claimed that she had stolen a pink duffel coat, infected it, then gave it back to them. They then spent days torturing and abusing her until she felt that enough was enough and she went back to her stepfather's house. On the 7th of December 1992, the group went to Suzanne's stepfather's house to look for Suzanne. When they met her, they all told her that a guy she fancied was at Jean's house looking for her. And since love was all Suzanne ever wanted, she was thrilled to the core. She joyfully followed the others to Jean's house, not knowing that that singular decision marked the end of her days. Upon her arrival, Suzanne was held down and shaved everywhere, including her eyebrows. She was then forced to clean her own hair off the floor and throw it out. After that, she was covered with a plastic bag. The group then took turns hitting her in different parts of her body, including her head, with heavy belt buckles and large wooden spoons, until she was in and out of consciousness. She was beaten so severely that one of her arms broke and hung limply at her side. Soon after, she was locked in a cupboard without food, water, and denied the toilet. However, for the next few days, Suzanne's constant screams for help traumatized the children, and so they moved her to Bernadette's abandoned home. Over the next 5 days, her suffering continued. Suzanne was tied spread eagle to an upturned bus spring mattress with exposed boards. They used electrical wires and then stuffed Suzanne's mouth with stockings to muffle her screams. They would beat her regularly. It's believed that at one point, Jean spent 2 hours alone in the room beating Suzanne. The group would also inject her with amphetamines, it's believed, so she wouldn't sleep. She was beaten, burned with cigarettes, and forced to listen to a song by Chucky, I Am Chucky, Wanna Play, at maximum volume through headphones. Bernadette would begin each torture section with the phrase, Chucky is coming to play. Eventually, just hearing the words alone would make Suzanne scream. Since Suzanne was denied the loo, she pooed and peed on herself, and once the stench of waste was too hard to bear, Jeffrey and Clifford shoved Suzanne into a bathtub filled with concentrated disinfectant and scrubbed her with a stiff brush so hard until her skin began falling off her body. If that wasn't bad enough, Clifford then used pliers to savagely pull off 2 of Suzanne's teeth. First, he hammered her teeth with the pliers, but that only chipped them, so he tightened his grip on them and used his full force to pull them straight out of their sockets. He pulled so hard that Suzanne's head came forward and there was a snap. By the end of the week, Suzanne had no life left in her. Both her arms were broken and her whole body was covered with burns and bruises. By the time Suzanne was declared missing, the group decided it was time to get rid of her. In the early hours of December 14, 1992, Suzanne was forced into the boot of a stolen car and driven to a remote and secluded area. They pushed Suzanne, fully naked, down a thorny embankment and poured gasoline all over her body and set her on fire. The group then heartlessly abandoned Suzanne, who was aflame and screaming, got into the car and started making their way home while singing, "Burn, baby, burn." But despite the agonizing torture, an unimaginable level of pain she had to endure, with 80% of her body covered in burns and her broken arms dangling limply beside her, Suzanne managed to drag herself up the embankment and crawled a quarter of a mile before she was discovered by 3 men going to work. They took her to a nearby house where the husband of the home reported. Both her hands appeared like ash, her legs were just like raw meat, and her feet appeared to be badly charred. I was struck by how polite she was. She was constantly thanking my wife for her assistance. Suzanne was whisked to the hospital, and before falling into coma, she managed to give the names of her 6 assailants as well as the address where the torturous ordeal had taken place. Suzanne, however, sadly died 4 days later on December 18th due to multiple complications without ever coming out of coma. A few days later, the police raided the House of Horrors and were moved to tears. In the bin they found Susan's hair, a pair of pliers, and her discarded teeth. At first, everyone denied their involvement in the case, but soon caved in after Anthony's father convinced him to tell the truth. However, they pushed the blame on each other and distanced themselves from the final act. In a trial that lasted 22 days, all members were found guilty and sentenced to different counts. Jean Powell, Bernadette, Anthony, and Glenn were found guilty of false imprisonment, conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm, and murder. They were all sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 25 years. However, Jean's sentence was later reduced by 2 years after she allegedly showed remorse and helped prevent a prison break. Clifford Hayes and Jeffrey Leigh were acquitted of the murder charge because the judge believed they were not present when Suzanne was set alight, but they were both found guilty of conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm and sentenced to 15 and 12 years respectively. To this date, only Bernadette, Jeffrey Leigh, and Clifford Hayes have been released. This is the sad story of Suzanne Capper, a teenager whose only desire was to be loved and accepted. I still find it difficult to comprehend the level of pain that Suzanne had to endure, but I find comfort in the fact that in her last moments, she fought to ensure that she got justice. I admire her bravery and her strength to carry on and fight. Suzanne has always been remembered to this day. This brings us to the end of today's case. Please consider subscribing, like this video, and leave us a comment on your thoughts on this case. Until next time, stay safe.